Excellent. Okay.
Thank you.
Got it. All right, well, welcome everyone, and thank you very much for coming along today to hear Rachel Smith from Humane Research Australia. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today on unceded lands belonging to the Wadawurrung peoples, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, future, and of course my deepest respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples who may be with us today. Rachel has very kindly agreed to come and speak to us today about alternatives to animal experimentation. And if you'll just excuse me for one moment while I reload the web page that has disappeared from my screen, I can read you Rachel's introduction. So Rachel Smith has been committed to various animal welfare causes since a young age. During her career, Rachel has worked for NGOs in the animal welfare and conservation fields in Europe, Asia, and Australia, as well as employment in the community sector for local, state, and federal government. Rachel holds a Master of Science in Animal Welfare Science, Ethics and Law from the University of Winchester, during which she undertook a dissertation project on freedom of information legislation and animal research. Rachel has been working at Humane Research Australia since November 2019. Thank you, Rachel. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for coming along. I know it's a bit of Zoom fatigue at the moment, but I'll try and make the talk as interesting as possible. I'm just going to try and share my screen, so just bear with me a second and I'll put my presentation up. Okay, I hope that's visible to everyone now. Well, thank you for the introduction, Kate. Yes, as Kate said, I'm the CEO at Humane Research Australia. I'm fairly new to the organisation, just under 2 years, and I've been CEO for just under a year of that. And thank you very much for inviting me here today and for all the work that DCAS does. So today I'm just going to give a very brief introduction to HRA for those who are not familiar with our work. Again, briefly touch on the use of animals in research and education in Australia. Provide some challenges from our perspective in advocating against animal experimentation. Some examples of research or activities academics have done in this field. Make some suggestions more broadly about what else could be done. And finish up with a few resources that I recommend if you're interested in this particular subject. So HRA, we're a non-profit member-based organisation based in Melbourne. Our mission is to advocate for scientifically valid and humane non-animal methods of research. Essentially, we exist to provide an antidote to, I guess, a common misperception that animal experimentation is a necessary evil. And how we do that is scrutinising the research that's taking place in Australia and, I guess, exposing and bringing to attention that research, providing our analysis of why we object and how else it could have been performed, and then disseminating that information. So it might be via our social media, or we have a range of reports, newsletters, information that we convey to universities, case studies, multiple channels. So we're really a campaigning organisation. We have a range of campaigns, for instance, the Right to Release campaign and a campaign to ban primate experimentation. But as well as being an organisation, I also see us as being a resource. So we have information for those who may be wishing to use alternative methods, or for students, or for researchers. So a campaigning organisation and a resource. So giving a broad overview of the use of animals in research and education in Australia, it's quite difficult to get a comprehensive picture because there is a lack of reporting and publication of statistics. So each state and territory may choose to collate information and then whether to report that information. And they may be reporting to different timeframes, and depending on their state legislation, different classifications of which animals would be included in the reporting. And so we every year try and publish statistics, but they're very approximate because of those limitations. And some states and territories which are not publishing information, we are basing on statistics from years ago. So there can be huge discrepancies between years. So it's very difficult to get that picture and to assess any trends. From the estimates that we do, I would say it's approximately 10 million animals per year, and that really can vary between years. And Australia is often cited as one of the world's highest users of animals for scientific purposes. Generally, that's falling behind the US and China. But it should be noted that not all the research is invasive. It can be conservation or observational research without any necessary negative impact on the animals, and that's also included in those figures. So it does depend on how each country's report. So the use includes rodents, farm animals, fish, non-human primates, dogs, cats, and wildlife. There is an Australian code for the care and use of animals for scientific purposes, and generally that code is then reflected in state and territory legislation, really by a system of self-regulation. So different institutional animal ethics committees will approve research, and then there'll be a regulator that may be providing some oversight, and generally every 4 year doing an inspection. And there are various funders. So there is government funding, the National Health and Medical Research Council, Australian Research Council, Medical Research Future Fund, state and territory funding, and also private individuals, trusts and foundations, and private funding. So looking at research at Australian universities, most research falls under the classification of basic research. It also sometimes termed as fundamental research. So that may be more curiosity-driven research, or it may be, I guess, in a medical sense, trying to find the mechanisms behind a particular disease. So it may not at that point, or maybe even in the future, not have a translational value. We find it easier to obtain information about research that is conducted at universities because we can access the scientific publications or research repositories than pharmaceutical research, which may be more concealed for confidentiality, business confidentiality reasons, or because the animal research might be outsourced overseas. So a lot of our case studies are from Australian universities. You can find them on our website by species, and we also have some for non-animal research, and we have an on your doorstep map, which I guess is a pictorial illustration of where the research is taking place, and then you can review that case study that we've profiled and any action in opposition to that research. So some examples of the type of case studies that may then fall into a campaign. So we have some related to the forced swim test. And for those who are not familiar with this test, it's a test that was designed to, I guess, screen antidepressants based on how quickly a mouse or rat resists trying to keep swimming in a beaker of water. And then we have traumatic brain injury research, which will involve, in some cases, a weight drop to a rodent to inflict a traumatic brain injury, and forced inhalation studies where mice will be in an inhalation chamber to try and induce conditions that would be associated with smoking. So we oppose these for various reasons. It could be that it's unethical, or we feel that it could be achieved in another way, or it's repeating knowledge that's already been in existence, or repeating other studies. So we have a range of different criteria on why we might be objecting. So during 2019 to 20, approximately $380 million was expended on active grants that indicated they require animal ethics review as part of the National Health and Medical Research Council funded research. So that's about 40% of their total funding. This was obtained from a question to the Senate. It's generally quite hard to get this information, but when we do, it's generally around the 40% mark that we see from applications. So perhaps it could be that someone's applied and then that research does not take place, or they extend the research and use more animals, but that's the funding at the time of the application. So I'm going to give an example here of one of our case studies, an example of publicly funded research which we have critiqued, and it will give you a bit of a rundown of why we have profiled this research. So looking at feeding patterns in rats. So 24 rats were randomly assigned a standard lab chow diet or a high-fat cafeteria diet. This was over $414,000 of a National Health and Medical Research Council grant, and the necessity of this experiment was approved by the University of New South Wales Animal Care and Ethics Committee. And the result, the rats preferred pies, dim sums, biscuits and lamingtons to standard chow. They snacked more frequently and they weighed more at the conclusion of the experiment. So I think you can see that these findings are really not revolutionary, and I think could have been forecast without doing this experiment. So was this research justified? Was there no suitable alternative? Numerous human studies have already been conducted. The repetition, almost identical rodent studies already conducted. Does this project obtain and establish significant information relevant to the understanding of humans and or animals? How could this money have been spent better? And then the issue of the validity of rats as models, because of the various differences between them and humans, and in particular relating to how they distribute food and stress-related physiological distortions. In our mind, this was a completely worthless use of money that could have been spent elsewhere. So I wanted to give a couple of examples of case studies that were involved, I guess, in the area of Geelong for those who are attending from Deakin campus in Geelong. So we have a couple of case studies on our website at the moment featuring CSIRO. The first one is not involving animals. It was a fairly recent one, which was quite widely publicised in the media, the effect of temperature on persistence of SARS-CoV-2 on common surfaces. And then I think it's probably about 5 years ago, macaques infected with simian human immunodeficiency virus. And that was obviously an animal one, which we profiled with an action. And we recently profiled another case study, which was involving CSIRO approval for SIV research, antibody research, again using macaques. I think 24 macaques in this case were killed. And in the conversations with CSIRO, it came about that they approved the research, but they stated that another university actually conducted the research, but it was approved by their animal ethics committee. And we do find this often happens. It's hard to deduce exactly who's doing the research, because one ethics committee can approve for more than one university, and it can take place at a different campus, but by different researchers and they might collaborate together. So their correspondence to us cited that they were no longer using primates, but whether that is an ongoing commitment remains to be seen. And more recently, there was another example in the media of CSIRO, which again was more positive in that they were using 4 types of clinically relevant human tissues and machine learning to fast-track COVID-19 treatments. So in terms of Deakin University, we don't actually have any case studies profiled there. I'm not overly familiar with any of their research, but I know they have 2 animal ethics committees, one in Geelong and one in Burwood. And I had a quick look on their website and did a search, and there was a lot of hits coming up for mice and mice research. So obviously research is going on, but I can't really give a critique of it without knowing a great deal about it. So in terms of involvement of universities, as stated previously, basic research and university research forms the majority of animal research in Australia. And Universities Australia is the co-author of the Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research, Ethical Conduct in Human Research, and the Australian Code for Animal Research. And they co-author these documents with the Australian Research Council, the National Health and Medical Research Council. So they are quite heavily involved in that. We engage with them in various ways. It may be with individual students or with the Vice Chancellor of Research, the Ethics Committee. And we have differing levels of engagement depending on the university and the history they've had with us and the type of research they're doing. We will share resources and examples of alternatives. But as I said, yeah, it does vary between the universities. So now I want to move on to some challenges that we find in advocating against animal experimentation. And I know that a lot of people listening are familiar with the challenges in advocating in any animal advocacy field. So some of these may be familiar to you, but I'll try and touch upon why we think they're specifically relevant to animal experimentation. So in terms of the species that are used, quite often mice, rats, and fish, increasingly fish. So they're not a species that the general public is particularly bonded to or have empathy for. And that is particularly the case at the moment with the, as it's termed, mouse plague in New South Wales. I think that is also influencing public opinion. It takes place behind closed doors. The public are not always aware that it's happening. It's things like when the baboons escaped from New South Wales that people started to realise that it's actually still taking place. There's many barriers to obtaining transparency. So we try through FOI to get a lot of information, but that is often refused, and we don't even have information as to which institutes are using dogs and cats, for example, or if we were to ask for minutes of animal ethics committees, it's very unlikely we would get that information. So to be able to assess how effective the regulation is very difficult without that transparency. We see the argument that it's a necessary evil, portrayed that medical research needs to be obtained, and unfortunately animals' value is more than human, and we couldn't achieve progress without animals, so that's a sacrifice that has to be made. So yeah, I think informing people that that's not necessarily true. And I also often see a case of animal research being justified by those who are involved with the industry by comparing it to other animal uses. So, we use X number of animals for research, for food or for entertainment or for clothing. So it's fine because this is more justified than those uses. And often the case that may be viewed as anti-science. So animal activists against scientists, and we're seen as resisting science. But I think that is changing because there's so many organizations now that you'll find that the members or the staff of those organizations were involved in research or are involved in research, and they have a scientific background, or their advisory panel is, or their members are. So I think that is changing. So some more challenges. It can be very difficult for HRA to form partnerships with allies. So for example, we recently tried to apply to exhibit at the Consumer Health Forum of Australia annual exhibition or conference, and they responded that we didn't have values in alignment. And really we see it that we're both seeking the same, for consumers to have access to the best quality healthcare, but we just see perhaps a different way of achieving that. So that can be an obstacle. The transition to non-animal methods would require acknowledgement from funders and regulators that the current methods are not delivering. So there is a vast amount of money, some would argue not enough, invested in medical research. And I think there's an expectation that there's so many breakthroughs, and we're on the cusp of discovering a cure for cancer. But if there was public knowledge that really we're far away from that, and that there needs to be a change to the way that we're working, I think that would be difficult for the government to concede. Another issue is that it's quite complex to explain what the alternatives are as opposed to animal models. So the public do understand what is meant when the process of animal testing, so a drug is tested on a primate to see if it's safe or effective, and then it's tested on a human, they understand that. But if you're trying to explain what the alternatives may be in terms of computer modeling or 3D cell cultures or organ on a chip, organoids, it's quite difficult to explain that. I find it very difficult myself, and to explain it in a simple way and for people to understand what you're really talking about. Another issue is challenging the status quo. So there's careers, reputations, funding, and publications based upon animal research. So that is a threat to those who are involved in the industry to change that. And there's obviously resistance for any change, and particularly so when it's related to careers and funding and reputations. And another observation I found is that universities do not like to be seen as criticising one another. So the test I mentioned previously, the 4SWIM test, there are some universities in Australia that are choosing to no longer use this, but they are not publicly really speaking out and saying that they're not using this, and they're proud they're not using it, and why they're not using it, because other universities are, and I don't think they want to be seen as criticising their peers. So last slide of challenges, some more. I think often advocates feel they're not qualified to input because it's too difficult a subject, too controversial or too scientific. The pharmaceutical company in animal research is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and generally groups as ourselves are not resourced to be able to offer all that much of a threat. I'd say the limitations of the regulatory system, despite claimed high standards, and that's probably linked to the below point of reluctance to ban anything, because we see so much in the hands of institutional animal ethics committees, and we have a national code which is really quite broad, so it's updated. There's no set time frame, but generally about every 8 to 10 years, and it's just deliberately kept that to the principles of best practice without banning or forfeiting any specific procedure, with the belief that the animal ethics committees will provide that adequate oversight. But we see from the case studies that that's not necessarily happening. Another point I'd like to make is, I guess, the position of a very small minority, and we often sometimes see it on our social media posts in terms of making comments that instead of using animals, we should be using prisoners or child abusers or immigrants or vulnerable populations. And I don't think that portrays those opposed to animal research in a very ethical way, and implying that that is what we're suggesting rather than human relevant research. We're not obviously suggesting we use humans, but human relevant research. And finally, I guess from an organizational perspective, funding challenges, we don't obviously receive funding from the government, and when it's very difficult to get funding from trusts and foundations for this particular type of work, and we don't have DGR status because we're not classified as a hands-on animal welfare group or a health group. So that's just, I guess, a specific challenge to us. So these are some of the tactics that we use to overcome these challenges. So because everything is quite hidden and lack of transparency, we investigate and expose current practices to try and bring it to public scrutiny so people are informed and they can make an opinion based on the information that's brought to light. We collaborate with other transparency advocates because I don't think it's just animal research where there's a resistance to share information. So we're a member of Transparency International Australia. We do try and focus on the positives. So we have a humane charities list, which health charities can join if they're not using animals in research, and then we direct people to try and donate to them. We do try and engage with the scientific community and animal research industry. We obviously don't have all the same objectives, but we may have some shared objectives in trying to promote alternatives or rehome animals used in research, and we do try and present at their conference and share resources and information. We champion alternatives to animal methods. So we have a couple of reports, Better Ways to Do Research, which is a really comprehensive report on the alternatives available, and we have a business case given the financial rationale for transitioning to non-animal methods. We provide guidance to students. We will occasionally get students contacting us about something in their syllabus and asking us how they could encourage their lecturer to use another method or what would be viable. We provide, I would like to say, credible resources on a range of different areas. And we have a scientific basis thanks to our advisory panel. And we've recently hired a scientific outreach consultant who will be responsible for really getting our information and resources out to the scientific community, presenting at scientific conferences and engaging more with universities. So I hope we'll be able to be more active in that side. We also have on our website guidance for animal research industry personnel. So it's a resource about sharing different websites that may be useful information about the legislation, responsibilities for those who are on animal ethics committees, and it has an anonymous form for those who may want to share information with us without disclosing their identity about their concerns about something that they've observed or been involved with. So just briefly turning to why we shouldn't be using animals. I think this could be a presentation in itself, but I'm just going to give a few points here. So we're not arguing that no useful knowledge has been gained from animal research. It's more a case of we feel that its value is overstated and that there are alternative methods, and that the stagnation we're seeing could be overcome if we start investing more in these alternatives. So an important point to consider is that animal research has never been validated, whereas there's a requirement for non-animal methods before they can be accepted, a very stringent validation process. So we're comparing a very specific process to something that's just kind of been inherited as a practice. And there is an argument that in order for the value of animal research to be, I guess, evident, the data must be reliably and sufficiently translatable to human experiments. It must have provided data that could not have been provided in another way, and the data must be critical to ultimate human benefit. So it's not just a case of saying, oh, animals were used and we now have this cure. They must have been essential to that point. There's more to it than that. So in terms of issues with animal research, there are many factors, including lack of reproducibility, unreliability of animal models, the potential of dismissal of drugs due to animal reactions which may not be replicated in humans, wasted time and costs, and false hopes for patients. And you'll often hear cases cited of where animal research has led to a cure or where animal research has hindered progress. So we really rely on some recent systematic reviews which highlight a lack of translation rather than, I guess, tit for tat points or cherry picking cases. We are really finding that much of the animal research is leading to more animal research rather than patient outcomes. And that the availability of non-animal methods doesn't seem to be the sole consideration when evaluating research proposals. Just going to try and share a short video here, which is just going to expand a bit on these points from one of our advisors. If it doesn't work, I might hand over to Elena.
I think I'll give it a go on my end.
Thank you. Too. Oh, it's just starting now, I think. Or is that yours?
Good.
Yeah. Give it a go. If it doesn't start, then I'll, yeah. I'll hand over to you, Elena, I think.
Sure.
Well, if it wasn't for animal experimentation, obviously we're not going to have a lot of the medical treatments that we have today, like polio vaccine or any number of other things that only could ever have actually been discovered through some animal experimentation, as much as we might not like that.
Nobody really likes animal experimentation, but in order for the advancement of the medical profession and finding cures for diseases and so forth, I would think that it's pretty essential to test on animals, as much as I hate saying that. But ultimately, if it came down to my dog or my child, then unfortunately I would take my child over my dog, and that's just the way it is.
And I think it's important that we have research using animals so that we can stop, say, future diseases like polio from happening again in the 21st century.
So we need a more systematic way to try and evaluate how useful animal experiments really are in contributing to human healthcare advancements. So where then does the truth lie? How predictive are animals for human patients, and how much does animal experimentation really contribute to the advancement of human healthcare overall? In 2004, researchers from 3 British universities and Yale University noted in the British Medical Journal that clinicians and the public often consider it axiomatic or fundamental that animal research has contributed to human healthcare advancements, but only on the basis of anecdotes or unsupported claims. These constitute an inadequate form of evidence, they asserted, for such a controversial area of research, particularly given increasing competition for scarce research resources. And so they called for more formal evaluation of animal research, for example, via systematic reviews. Now, systematic reviews are considered to provide gold standard evidence about a wide variety of clinical or research questions, including those that investigate the contributions of animal experiments to human healthcare advancements. They're considered to provide the highest level of reliability about research questions for several reasons. Firstly, they aim to ensure that no relevant important evidence, such as published animal experiments in this case, no important evidence is missed, and they do this by checking multiple biomedical bibliographic database, so that's databases containing the scientific literature. So they do an exhaustive search, and they tend to end up with very large numbers of published animal experiments, sometimes more than 1,000 in some of these systematic reviews. Secondly, if they select any subsets of these large numbers for closer examination, they must use randomisation or similarly impartial and methodical means to eliminate any bias in the selection of cases. And finally, the entire study is done with sufficient impartiality and rigour to successfully achieve publication in a peer-reviewed biomedical journal, and that's a systematic review. In the last decade, I've been analysing and studying these systematic reviews and even conducting a few of my own, and these have formed the basis for my doctorate in this field and also my recent book on animal experimentation. There are at least 27 systematic reviews which have provided important insights into the level of contributions of animal experiments for human healthcare advancements. In only 2 of 20 cases did the conclusions of the authors indicate that animal experiments were significantly useful in contributing to the development of clinical interventions that are actually effective in human patients or substantially consistent with human outcomes. And one of those 2 cases was contentious because there was a small sample size.
Thank you, Elena. So I'm just going to move on to now. I find this quite interesting. It's some examples of non-translatable clinical science based on laboratory research. So it's looking at, I guess, quite major diseases and the developments in animals, and then assessing the success rate in humans with those cures. And for diabetes, all 195 methods that prevented or delayed development of type 1 diabetes in mice failed in people. We see again all the vaccines working in HIV in non-human primates, and only one one actually increased the human HIV risk. Alzheimer's disease, again, 300 different interventions successful, but in humans, only 5 drugs approved which only treat the symptoms. Again, stroke, 500 interventions successful, but not translating to humans. And the same with sepsis and ALS, 100 potential drugs established in animal models, but only found 1 beneficial compound in humans. And we see the billions of dollars that were invested there. And it's just, I think, pretty heartbreaking that it's not resulting in the cures that we would like to see. So now I'm just going to give some examples of what some academic have been doing in this field, and they all have differing beliefs on animal experimentation, but I think all have in common focused on improving the status quo. So some examples here. I'm not sure if you're already familiar with their work. So starting with Dr. Jane Johnson, looking at reconceptualizing the use of non-human animals in biomedical research. Monica Merckx, she was our former president, and she is the author of our Better Ways to Do Research, an overview of methods and technologies that can replace animals in biomedical research. Dr. Alexandra Whitaker at the Vet School at Adelaide. Her areas include animal welfare and effective states, systematic review and animal law. Siobhan O'Sullivan, looking at accountability, animal welfare regulation, transparency. So I think you can see there's quite a broad range of different areas. It's not just the scientific merits of animal research. There's quite a lot of areas of crossover. So I've suggested some here. Media reporting, I think that's quite interesting because recently there was a report published in the UK about media reporting of animal research breakthroughs. Well, medical research obtained from animal research reported in the media as breakthroughs, and then evaluating, I think the period was 20 years after, to see whether that actually had been a breakthrough. And in the vast majority of cases, there wasn't. Looking at the ethics of animal use, accountability factors, the ethics of xenotransplantation, conscientious objection, regulatory reform, cultural change, and the environmental impact of animal research. And we do have a page about that on our website. It's an area we've been looking at quite recently in terms of, I guess, bio waste for one. So some suggestions as to how academics contribute. So academics are familiar with and subscribe to, I hope, the requirements of transparency, good governance, accountability, and integrity. And your voice may hold more weight to it than other people's. If you're writing a letter to editors or an opinion piece, perhaps it may have more weight and be more likely to be published. I'm going to give an example here. So it's related to a situation in Otago in New Zealand where a new animal research facility opened. And Dr. Peter Walker is a senior lecturer at the University of Otago School of Social Sciences. His colleague had expressed an opinion in the newspaper, and he then published, his piece was published, which strongly opposed those of his colleague. It was quite a strong letter, which I'm going to read out. I don't know how everyone would feel about doing this about their colleagues, but I'm going to share his extract. So he's talking about his colleague, Blakey. Blakey states that the university is proud of the achievements of the science breakthroughs made at their facilities. However, he fails to list the achievements. One anonymous reader offers the breakthrough made by one study into polycystic ovary syndrome. This suggests that the great majority of research and testing and teaching overtaken at Otago is a replication of studies originating from universities and research institutes overseas or may just be for technical teaching purposes. If Professor Blakey is so proud of the Eccles building and the research that takes place there, perhaps he should arrange regular open days where the public of Dunedin can see what takes place with their tax money and in their name. There are a number of medical and research organisations worldwide that oppose animal models. One such is the US-based Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, which has more than 175,000 members worldwide. As well as animal welfare concerns, its objections include the non-applicability of animal studies to human medicine, as the physiology of animals, apart from primates, is so different from humans as to be worthless for study. Without drastic changes to support the welfare of animals, in time we will no doubt look back on this area of using animals in RTT as being as archaic and problematic as live vivisection in Victorian times is viewed today. So that was quite brave of him, I felt, and was quite interesting to see that published. So what else could academics do? So these are a few suggestions. Inform yourself on the issue and engage in constructive debate. Find out what research your institution is conducting, ask questions, request documentation. There may be vacancies on your institution or another institution's animal ethics committee. Obviously, that is a big commitment and a lot of time and effort, but it is an option. Speak to your colleagues or students about the issue. consider joining a committee or a board if it's something that you feel strongly about and you feel you can contribute in that way, or as an advisor. Facilitating relationships with your institution and HRA, so in terms of talks to medical students or science students, or having stall at open days, things like that. Conducting associated research and contribution to consultations. So often there'll be consultations by Department of Health or state government or other bodies where they're looking for submissions on a particular area where you may choose to make your opinion known. And some more generic points about what we can all do. So some suggestions here: sign up to the HRA e-newsletter, follow us on social media. You might wish to become a member or a donor, buy cruelty-free products, and you can consult the cruelty-free international website for a directory of cruelty-free products. Support health charities listed on the Humane Charities list. Support our campaign actions, which are generally emails to different institutions or funders. Or you may wish to volunteer for human-based research. There's quite a recent initiative called Join Us, and you can sign up to be on a research registry. And if you're selected for any particular criteria, then you can volunteer in those studies. And one of my colleagues has just been selected to do that. Some resources that I'd recommend. So firstly, our website, and we have our Better Ways to Do Research reports, social media, and we also have a podcast with a few episodes on there. The book I have the picture of here, Animal Experimentation, Working Towards a Paradigm Change. It's actually available as a free ebook. It covers a whole range of different aspects. It's a great book. I think it was published in 2019, so a little bit more recent than Andrew Knight's book. The Centre for Contemporary Sciences, that's a new organisation just founded in the US last year, and they have a lot of useful resources there and webinars and so on. Andrew Knight has two websites, animalexperiments.info and humanelearning.info, with some videos and resources and studies. And for those who are researchers, I recommend Early Career Researchers Network through Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. They have a lot of resources there about courses and training for those researchers choosing not to use animals. So thank you so much for listening in your time today. I've provided my contact email there. If you have any questions, I'm open to them now or receiving them by email later. And I've provided some links to our social media. We've got quite a few different channels out there. If there's any that you would like to subscribe to, then feel free to follow us or contact us with any questions that you have at all.
Thank you so much, Rachel.
Thank you.
There was so much in there that I learned, and that I'm always astonished by how much I don't know about this field. And if you're comfortable and willing to answer a few questions, we've got about 10 minutes for people to do that. So people, you can put your microphones on or type a question in the chat, and I'll read it out, whichever you'd like to do.
Sure. I'm just going to quickly open the door because my dog's scratching at the door. One sec. Come on then, if you come in or not. Come on, you may come in or not.
The old, are we in or are we out?
I know, it's just crying but not coming in, so. All right.
So questions or observations, comments, anything you want to respond to in all of that? There was a lot going on. Can see Yamini and Alexandra have both got their hands up. I'm not sure who was first, I'm sorry.
Yep.
I think it was
someone
Yamini.
Just go. Go ahead, Yamini.
Okay, thank you so much, Rachel. That was such a clearly articulated and such a precisely delivered presentation. And I mean, it's a model. It's a model for how to present. I'm sorry, I don't have my video on. It's just that my Zoom is so wobbly today that I think potentially it might help.
That's okay.
Yeah. I just had a really quick question about whether you might be able to tell us a little bit about the scale of, the scale of the production sector that actually breeds animals for experimentation. So I was wondering whether academic research is incentivized in some way by, whether, for example, whether we might get bigger grants if we use, if we have animal experimentation as part of a research methodology, for example.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering about the scale of the animal production sector, which, I mean, on the one hand, academics can make the choice to conduct research differently, but it kind of reminds me a little bit about, vegans making the choice, making a more individualized or personalized choice to implement different food habits, for example, right? So it kind of comes up to the individual rather than a more institutional change.
Yeah.
If you see what I'm saying? So I'm wondering whether there was any sort of advocacy that was pitched at the I mean, I'm not even sure what this looks like, but breeding, the breeding of animals for research, or and just the scale of it. Like, I was wondering, in comparison to the farmed animal sector, for example, which is obviously runs in the trillions, how would you compare experimental animal breeding with farmed animal breeding, for example?
Well, yeah, it's much smaller scale. There are, I guess, in terms of the animals that are most commonly used, mice and rats. There are two large animal breeding suppliers, one in New South Wales and one in WA, and it's actually quite topical because I think it's called the Animal Resources Centre in WA. It's subsidised by the WA state government, and it's currently running at a loss, and they are no longer wishing to subsidise it. So that facility is, well, according to reports, due to be closing within the next 2 to 3 years.
Okay.
So that will be one of the, and so we have written to the WA state government to say this is an opportunity to use more human relevant, consider more thoroughly about how the research could be achieved rather than automatically using mice. And we see, for example, some PhD publications where they may be using 2,000, 3,000 mice for their PhD.
Wow.
Yes, being approved. So at least those kind of things, you would think there would be more scrutiny if it's harder to get hold of them. But the response from a lot of the universities seems to be that they will be, setting up their own breeding places, and then if they don't have the necessary expertise, because you have to breed certain strains and they genetically modify them and all these things, that there may be more wastage because they don't have that same skills that those centres are having. So I hope that closing down will be an opportunity for there to be more scrutiny before they automatically turn to that. But I worry that the universities will then start breeding their own, and then that might result in more wastage. I don't know.
Wow.
Yeah.
Those numbers are beyond belief. 3,000 mice during a course of one PhD.
Yes, exactly. In inhalation studies, and particularly abhorrent research. So
yeah. Oh my God. Thank you so much for that, Rachel.
It's okay.
That's staggering. I'm still kind of coming to terms with those numbers. Alexandra?
Hi, everyone. Hi, Rachel.
Hi.
I've got my video off as well because of the same sorts of issues Yamini was talking about. But I just really wanted to commend you on your work and the clarity of your presentation and arguments. And you probably did mention this, but I just wanted to talk about conversations that I've had with Rachel. I'm developing animal law, online animal unit for our undergraduate law degree. And the resources that the Humane Research Association have been so helpful. And I suppose that's the other way of embedding these issues into the undergraduate lease curricula is through talking about this from a legal perspective as well, and looking at it as a regulatory issue.
Yep, I definitely agree. And because we just come against this standard response often that, the research is undertaken according to the code and the university uses the best standards possible. But there's a lot of gaps in that. You can have a system in place which has got weaknesses, and then the enforcement of that is not scrutinized thoroughly either. So I think definitely the legal aspect as well. We haven't got so many resources on the on the legal side, but we will be developing more. We have our own kind of internal briefings that we would deliver to politicians, but we'd like to expand them with a bit more public education about to counteract that assurance that everything is, best practice and the highest standard. Because I think if a lot of people knew, that in animal research, there are the people that are performing surgery on the animals in animal research don't have to have any veterinary qualifications, and we would not be permitting that on our pet animals. So I think, if a lot of information more was shared about the deficiencies in the regulatories, then that couldn't be so reliant on that standard response.
Wow, thank you.
Can
I go ahead?
Go for it. Go for it.
No, you go. You go, and then I'll go.
Oh no, I didn't want to be too greedy. Just keep jumping in with questions. Well, I just had a really quick one, Rachel. So there's a move now with a lot of people in the humanities and social sciences, for example, doing a lot of research on animals, and we don't really have research ethics protocols that are attuned and pitched to social sciences research. A lot of our social sciences research, for example, is very much focused on very animal justice, animal liberation sorts of agenda. But we are subject to the same protocols that, as someone who's experimenting on animals might have, for example. So we are subject to the 3 R's: reduce, reduce the number of animals, whereas that's actually almost completely opposite to what we want to do. We don't want to reduce, we actually want to increase the number of animals and make them more visible in our research, So I was wondering whether your organization is thinking of potentially doing some work around the ethical how animal ethics could sort of be conceptualized for researchers working in humanities and social sciences and arts, and these would involve living animals, usually observation. Okay. But in their natural surroundings, sometimes it's in dairy farms. I mean, so what I'm saying is, when we are, what sort of is there a move? I'm not asking what should be appropriate protocols, because I realize that's a really big and unfair question. But is there a sense of expanding it beyond the disciplinary boundaries of natural sciences?
We haven't really considered that. I guess we sometimes, when we're doing submissions about legislation, that issue comes up about whether we are in support of, I guess, they call it a risk, a kind of risk-based framework for licensing. So in that case, I think they would be, and we do support that. If it's just observational research, then it wouldn't necessarily need to have a specialist to assess it and so on. But I think the issue is that often it's the institution has to have a license rather than the specific project. So if we were to have that approach for the institution, then there could be at one university some very harmless research going on and some really invasive research going on. So probably our recommendation would be that institution has a license and then individual projects have a license. And if they're really low level of invasiveness, then that would require less scrutiny. But at the moment, there's only that one. I guess they want to reduce the burden and have one license instead of, like in the UK, where they would have to have the person involved would have to have a license, the institution would, and then each project gets reviewed to have a license. So without that framework, it would be quite hard when it's all at institution level, if that makes sense. But we do, when we make submissions, say that it's particularly in terms of the statistics, we're not opposed to observational research being in a different classification or not having to go through the same process. I know it came up in a conference a couple of weeks ago, and someone mentioned that some observational research can involve drones and that can cause harm. And I guess there's things to be worked out still, but we wouldn't think that you should have to go through the same level of scrutiny as someone who's killing 2,000 mice.
We do, it's crazy though.
Yeah.
Thanks, Rachel.
My question was a very general one, but it might be a bit too big a question for the tail end of the seminar. I guess and maybe something for people to just sort of take away and think about. I've been reading this book, which I got from HRA when I was up a few months ago.
Yeah.
And it's a terrific book. And the chapter I'm reading at the moment deals with this question of justification, you know, and it tracks back through the history of that, you know, in vivisection and biomedicine. So it must just be so difficult when you're dealing with organizations, universities, companies to deal with that question. But if we were advocating and talking to the person on the street, like those Dumbos in the video that you showed, what's the go-to argument around justification, and how do we get people to kind of switch off that cognitive dissonance that's based on years and years of being fed these lies about, oh, you know, my dog but not my kid, you know, that position.
Yeah, I know what the best approach is. Personally, when I'm, I guess, talking to people about it, I try not and delve too much into the history. You know, you can have really long-winded conversations about, oh, was penicillin, or was this one developed with, what led to this or what led to that? Was it the humans or the animals for this? But I just try and focus on more on, there are so many more tools available now, and I think people generally, opinion polls show that people think we shouldn't be using animals when there's alternatives available, but they just are under the belief that those alternatives are not really available yet. So I think if you just, I try and tend to relate it to, there's so much more technology now and so much more innovation, and there isn't the success rate that we're hoping to see. So it's time to embrace changes to try and get it to that point. And I guess it's not going to convince everybody. And I do kind of see myself in terms of monitoring response from the animal research industry. I see the argument changing now. They're not really saying one or the other, but they generally will say non-animal research methods are complementary to the animal research. So it's shifting away, but they're still seeing it as a component of broader work. So it's just, I think we share as much as we can on our social media and our channels about the alternatives that are available, and how they're being used, and if they've got a higher success rate or if they're more accurate, and then we highlight those. But that's basically what I do, just talk about the future and what's happening now, rather than talk about historical debate about what could have been done or what couldn't have been done, because I think lots change, you know, even in the space of a couple of years. And I think if there is a drug that gets to market without using animals, and there's a couple of cases in the US of challenges to the FDA of trying to get drugs approved that haven't been tested on animals, I think if that were to happen, then that would really progress the argument as well, to show that it is safe and it has been achieved quicker and without using animals and without spending as much. So maybe that would also cause the regulators to change the language they use for the requirements as well. Maybe some test cases will help.
Thank you. So very much a focus on, you know, the science, I guess, inverted commas, and avoiding the emotional in order to, and but there is so much on your website, and I really enjoy seeing the social media posts that the HRA put up, and I really encourage everyone here, if you're not already, to follow HRA on all the social media channels, because there's just so much that we still have to learn. Thank you so much for this wonderful session.
You're welcome. Thank you everyone for listening, and good luck with all your work as well.
Thank you so much, Rachel.
Thank you,
Kate, for organizing.
Nice to meet everyone. Have a good evening.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye. Thanks for your help, Elena. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Elena. Hey, Rachel, thank you.
Oh, no, you're very welcome.